But then you can also argue that frankly, nothing has changed. Again, I'll give you 3 arguments to illustrate why nothing has changed. Firstly, if you look at US and China, sure, on the surface, everything is fine. But if you look underneath the surface, the geopolitical rivalries have begun. And indeed, if you want to understand, for example, how this modern miracle, the US-India nuclear deal came about, the US-India nuclear deal was at least in part a result of a geopolitical realization by United States of America that my future challenger is China, I want India as an insurance, I'll give India US nuclear deal. That's how geopolitics works. Nothing has changed. And then if you look at Europe, where you have zero prospect of war between any 2 EU member states, and while no 2 EU states are fighting each other directly with armies, as recently as 10 years ago, you had a major Balkans war, and the major Balkans war was a proxy war within the European member states, with some EU member states supporting Serbia, some EU member states supporting Croatia and Slovenia. And I can tell you, when I was ambassador to the UN, one of the EU ambassadors told me that EU officials had been asked to go back to their archives and look at what happened in the First World War, because they said the Balkans War was a repetition of the First World War. So nothing has changed. And of course, if you look at small states, in theory, small states are not being invaded. But as recently as a few months ago, when, for whatever reason, you can blame Georgia, you can blame Russia, Georgia was invaded by a major power as a neighbor. So nothing has changed. Now, the reason I emphasize all that is that when it comes to looking for solutions to where we are today, please be very careful. There are no firm, definite ideas that we can turn to in terms of predicting how the world is going to come about. So if you look ahead in the 21st century, it is possible, and by the way, you can paint 3 completely different scenarios, and don't rule out any of these scenarios. And so I'm going to talk a bit about 3 scenarios, and in some ways apply them to some extent to what's happening in South Asia too. The first scenario is that in the 21st century, we will essentially return to the 19th century. And here, you can pick up textbooks, you can pick up magazines that will tell you, written by eminent scholars in the West, that say that Asia's future is Europe's past, and just as in 19th century Europe, as new great powers emerged, you saw wars happen. So they say Asia is where the new powers are emerging, and therefore you will have wars happening here. And here, of course, and this I'm coming into very sensitive territory here, the one area which probably has today the greatest prospect of war probably is the India-Pakistan border. And last night I was watching Indian television, and there was one channel, I don't know which one, which was describing military capabilities and describing, who would win, who would lose in such a war. And it reminded me that it's still possible to go back into the 19th century. And here the one point I want to make, but I'm glad that the world's authority on India-Pakistan is here, Steve. So I'm going to choose my words very carefully. If you look in what happened in Mumbai, essentially, was to some extent a replication of what happened in 9/11 in New York, Manhattan. And I was there in Manhattan when 9/11 happened. And the terrorists who attacked Manhattan clearly wanted to do damage, wanted to kill people. But they had a larger strategic objective. And the larger strategic objective was to get America to react angrily against the Islamic world. And sure enough, America invaded Afghanistan, which I think was the right thing to do. Because Al-Qaeda was in Afghanistan, that was the right thing to do. But then unfortunately, America, the Bush administration, also decided to invade Iraq. And I can tell you that the invasion of Iraq, partly because it was illegal, it was not sanctioned by the UN Security Council, partly because of the incredible incompetence, was a geostrategic gift to those forces that wanted to create divisions between America and the Islamic world. And so you see, 7 years later, as we look back, Rumsfeld asked a very simple question. Are we killing more of them, or are they producing more against us? And the answer is they're producing more against us.